Okay.
Evening, everyone. We're continuing our reading of Harley Davidson Enthusiast from 1941. This is part 7. We're starting February 1941. Here's the gentleman here. Beautiful bike. It's got a hog snout tail light. No tail light in the sidecar. That was extra money. Didn't really need it. No traffic. Enthusiast, a magazine for motorcyclists. And Joe will find out inside what mountain range this is and where he's at, but he's out in the boonies. So we shall begin. Mother and I Go Touring by Carl Anderson. I assume by that he means his wife. She looks rather young in the photos. And can't quite see what he's on. Looks like a 39. Oh, here we go. I can see the badge. That's a 40 in the photo. That's a 1940. Ever since I can remember, I have been a motorcycle enthusiast. Unlike many boys, I didn't have to win over my mother to the sport. She has been a motorcycle fan as long as I have. At our family table, motorcycles have been one of the main topics of conversation. One day, Mother says, "Carl, how about a trip to the east this year?" "Fine," I answered. "I'd like nothing better. Let's make our plans right away." What a mother. Wow. I guess must have had him pretty young. She sounded like a young chickadee. At first, Dad didn't seem very much interested. By the time Mother and I had completed our plans, he too was grinning from ear to ear. It got so that whenever I wanted to do some work on the 61 overhead valve, the machine was gone, and so was Dad. In no time at all, Mother and I had converted him into a real enthusiast. I'll never forget the longing look in his eyes the day we left. Getting back to our story, I got my introduction to two-wheeling by first driving a Servicar. The next step was driving a solo job. I had no trouble at all. Soon Mother hopped on behind and took her first ride. She's been a steady passenger ever since. I guess that is his mom. Boy, she looks young. I can't remember just how many thousand miles she's covered. My first solo machine was an old 31 Harley Davidson, which I picked up in the spring of '39. We had a lot of fun on that old job, but we wanted a new one for our trip. Then we went to dealer Barfield's and looked over the new Harley Davidsons. That's how I became the proud owner of the 61 overhead valve. Did we ever get the thrills while packing for our trip? I had a piece of sheet metal welded to the luggage carrier on each side, holes that were made at the proper places, and the saddlebags were attached securely. On top of the luggage carrier, I anchored a board just long enough to hold a metal suitcase. Next, a big heavy box of things went on, carefully wrapped in black oilcloth. A small but strong rope was used to tie the case and box securely. Not once on the trip did we have to readjust our load. It stayed secure, just as we figured. We carried our gloves, scarves, and other frequently needed items in the saddlebags where we could get at them easily. We left Memphis, Tennessee on May 18th with 3 glorious weeks of adventure and freedom ahead of us. The 61 overhead valve had 3,000 miles on it. It was running perfectly. We had a lot of time, so we decided to take it easy on the whole trip. From Memphis, we turned north, meaning to spend our first night in Louisville, Kentucky. 40 miles short of our goal, the storm caught us at Elizabethtown. We didn't mind in the least, however. We had a nice cabin and the most delicious supper. For breakfast, we had hot biscuits and country ham. Oh boy. We resumed our trip the next morning amid the rain. From there on, we encountered wet weather frequently during our trip, but it didn't dampen our spirits in the least. On we rolled, drinking in the scenery and enjoying every mile of our adventure. Ohio presented a wonderful sight with its rolling hills, open valleys, and hundreds of towns, villages, and cities of all sizes. We crossed the northern tip of Pennsylvania into the state of New York. We stayed at Buffalo a couple of days, and of course spent most of our time gazing at the falls. No description or picture can do justice to the wonder of nature. The power plant and all the adjacent land were heavily guarded. Now, let's stop here. Today, there's no power plant at Niagara Falls. The reality is Niagara Falls was the very first power plant in this country. Look it up. The very first one. The power plant and all of the adjacent land were heavily guarded. Barbed wire was strung all around the plant, and guards with rifles were stationed here and there. It certainly looked strange to see all those warlike precautions in the midst of peaceful surroundings, yet such measures are necessary when the country is at war. The interference with the falls as a producer of electric power would indeed be a serious blow to Canada. Now, for those who don't know, when the UK got drawn into the war, which was, I believe, 38, if I recall correctly without looking it up. I would have looked that up if I'd known he was going to be talking about Canada here, but I'm reading this as I go. Canada, being under the subject of the crown, was immediately drawn into the war. And there were a whole lot of American citizens going up into Canada to enlist with the Canadian Air Force and the Royal Air Force in England and so forth, so they'd go fight Hitler. A lot of old boys went up and did that. It was very common. So we'll stop here and look at the previous photos here. Here are some of the highly treasured pictures which Carl Anderson and his mother took on the vacation trip. Number one, Carl and his mother.
Okay.
So it says that is his mother up here. Boy, she looks young. She looks like she's 16. Wow.
Okay.
And then Mrs. Anderson and Canadian policeman, number 2. That's her right here.
Lower.
Lower it?
Yeah.
Okay. Right there.
Okay.
It's his mom and a Canadian policeman. Number 3, historic Mount Vernon.
Okay.
Mrs. Anderson with Lake Erie in
Raise it
background.
up.
That's number 4, right here.
I don't see it. Let me see. Oh, where's it?
You got it?
Yeah, right there. Okay.
And then number 5 is Peace Bridge between Buffalo and Fort Erie, right there. I'm not even sure if Fort Erie is still around or not.
Right there. Okay.
And then number 6 is Cherry Orchard in Bloom in New York. That's right here.
Raise it up.
And you can see
too high.
their big rack
Right
that
there.
had everything with all their stuff on the back. A lot of stuff. On small brace rear fenders, that's a lot of stuff. Wow. The capital of the United States, number 8. It's here.
Oh, let me get it close up. Oh, I see it. Okay.
And 9 is the tomb of the unknown soldier in Arlington National Cemetery. Now that was a monument to World War I. I think it still is.
Raise it up a little. Right there. Okay.
Right there. A lot of guys lost their lives in those trenches, and no trace of them. I don't know who they were. We shall continue. Through the beautiful countryside of New York State, we rolled along on Highway 20 to Auburn. Here we stopped and went through the Auburn prison, where the first electrocution in this country took place in 1890. The present institution consists of modern buildings, but the original prison was one of the oldest prisons in the United States. The first prison was built in 1816. Having read much about the prison, we were glad to see it. Resuming our pleasant motorcycle journey through New York, we found ourselves next to Albany, the state capital. We saw the governor's office, which is luxuriously furnished and has a huge fireplace. Wouldn't mind having one like it for myself. Paintings of famous men decorate its walls. In the flag room, we saw many historic flags as well as relics of Civil War days, including a letter said to be the last historical document Lincoln wrote. Shortly after crossing the Massachusetts state line, we were stopped by the state police who asked to see our license registration. Mother had failed to mention registration to me, and I assumed she had it along with the bill of sale and our driver's license, but we discovered to our embarrassment that I was at home. I think the only reason they let us proceed was because we had Canadian stickers and maps, and they probably thought that if Canada accepted us, we might be all right. We arrived home for our registration and picked it up later in Boston. Incidentally, Massachusetts was the only state in which we were asked for our registration. It taught us a lesson. Always be sure to take it with us on our future trips. We enjoyed every minute of our grand visit in Boston, although our arrival, the thermometer registered 37 degrees, which was some change for us as it was in the 80s when we left Memphis. A colored man and his wife kindly directed us away across Boston to Everett, where relatives awaited for us. Now, at the time, that was perfectly PC. We wouldn't use that word today. It would be considered an insult, but this was perfectly PC at the time. Remember the time in which this was written. The South was still segregated. We certainly appreciated this gesture as we hadn't the slightest idea how to cross Boston. During the days that followed, Mother and I took full advantage of every waking moment. There were dozens upon dozens of historic spots to visit. We saw King's Chapel and the Old South Church, the Boston Common, and many other places enshrined in the early history of our country. We had luncheon at a quaint little upstairs tea room on the wharf where we would sit by a window and watch the fishermen, some mending their nets on the wharf and others in their boats. One of the finest things we saw was the Maparium, not sure how to pronounce that, in the Christian Science Publishing House. The spectacular world in colors on the interior of a 30-foot globe is composed of 608 glass panels and is lighted by 300 lights placed outside the globe. Electric clocks at the equator line give the comparative times throughout the world. One views this marvel from a glass bridge running through the center. We visited in Winchester and in Brockton too. Our friends in Brockton had a cabin up on the Cape, so we went along with them. Fun. Mother and I were enjoying every minute of it. We saw Plymouth Monument, Plymouth Rock, and Buzzards Bay. It is 321 years since the Pilgrims first set foot on historic Plymouth Rock. America has come a long way since then. A beautiful granite portico has been erected to protect this famous landmark. Directly above the rock is Coles Hill, crowned with a bronze statue of Massasoit, the good Indian Sachem. New England is literally covered with historical landmarks, but unfortunately we had to move along. Mother and I promised ourselves another and more leisurely trip through this charming region at a later date. Regretfully, we bid our friends goodbye and headed our Iron Mount toward New York. We arrived in New York City in the midst of a downpour, but we didn't mind the rain too much as we were having a mighty fine time. So I'm going to stop this here. We'll go over these pictures. Just 321 years ago, the Pilgrims set foot on historic Plymouth Rock, Carl shown by the granite portico which covers the famous landmark. I'm assuming they're talking about this picture here. In Winchester, the Andersons visited the Bratt home. Occupying the buddy seat in this picture is Mrs. Virginia Bratt, right here.
Lowered.
You got that?
Yeah, right there. Yeah.
Right there. Mm-hmm. In this picture here, we made friends with a number of motorcycle officers on a trip here. Carl is asking directions of a New York State Trooper, also Harley Davidson mounted. That's this picture here.
Okay.
And the officer in question is on a 1939, it appears. Mm-hmm. And this picture here, it says, in front of a tourist home in Ashland, Ohio. Note how securely the suitcases are strapped on, how compactly everything is arranged. Well, we got turn to page 22 here. Says, rain or shine, mountains or valleys, or 61 was humming. Sweetly and long, whisking us from state to state with the greatest of ease. We spent 3 exciting days in New York. We got more thrills out of the skyscrapers than out of the fair. The buildings are hard to believe even when one is looking at them. As usual, it rained once we got out on the highway, so instead of stopping in Philadelphia, we kept on going to Washington. Then came a real break in the weather. For 5 straight days, the sun shone steadily. Washington is beautiful in any kind of weather, but especially when bathed in brilliant sunshine. We arrived at night, and after cleaning up a bit, we rode down among the government buildings. What a mighty thrill we got as we saw the lighted dome of the Capitol shining down upon the city in quiet benediction. The beauty and simplicity of the Lincoln Memorial and all it stands for filled us with emotion. We left Washington feeling that every citizen ought to visit the capital of his country. We continued our homeward journey through Virginia and last arrived in our beloved Tennessee. I'm going to stop here for a second. I've been to D.C. Certainly haven't been through all the buildings, but I've been there. If you feel strongly about being an American or wanting to become an American, you've got to visit the Capitol. Even though our country is no longer what it used to be, you need to go visit the Capitol. It's like a must. It's like #1 in your bucket things to do in life. It's really important. We continued our homeward journey through Virginia and last arrived in our beloved Tennessee. It seemed good to be back in our native state. After a brief halt in Knoxville, we passed through Nashville and soon we were home again. Maybe you think Dad wasn't glad to see us. What a joyful homecoming we had. Riding double with a sports shield and carrying about 50 pounds of luggage, we covered 3,300 miles and spent only $21.08 for gas and oil, $29.88 for meals, and $23.50 for rooms, making a total cost of less than $75. Try and do that today. I can't imagine anyone with $75 ever having brought more fun than we had. Every place we stopped, a crowd would gather to look us over and ask questions. They invariably would ask if my passengers were my sister or my wife. Told you she looked young. And we always got a kick out of their expressions when they found out the girl on the buddy seat was my mother. They seemed unable to believe that anyone old enough to have a grown son would be interested in motorcycling, but Mother's big smile assured them that she was having the time of her life. They looked doubtful, but I bet it set some of them thinking about investigating the discreetness of all outdoor sports. By the conclusion of our trip, found 15,600 miles on our motor, and every one of them had indeed been miles of enjoyable riding. We were already planning another swell vacation. Mother and I just couldn't get along without our Harley Davidson. I think that was a very cool story. Good night, everybody. I hope you sleep good.